Here we go. To bring you the swine breeding stock care webinar on nutrition. Your presenter today is Dr. Elizabeth Hines at Penn State Extension. And a couple housekeeping notes. Captioning services are available. You can follow the link available in the chat. You're welcome to add any questions you have throughout the presentation to the chat box. And this is the last webinar in the series. So keep your eyes out for a follow-up email. It will have the recorded webinars for the past four webinars that we have recorded in this series. I believe that's all I have. Dr. Hines, are you ready?
Yes, ma'am. Can you all see my screen?
We can.
Okay, should have two adorable piglets trying to steal their mother's food on it. So, yes, as Colleen said, this is the last in our series. This has been a good series to kind of get some basic information out there for breeding stock care. Might have had too much information at some times, maybe not enough at others, but it gives us a good starting point to build off of. And then for those of you that have more to learn, or more that you would like to learn, feel free to let us know what else you're interested in knowing. Today we're going to talk a little bit about nutrition. This is a pet topic of mine. I am a swine reproductive physiologist that has had a special interest in nutrition for a long time now. You will learn as we go through this presentation, there's a lot we know about nutrition, but there's not a lot that we know about certain stages of production in regard to nutrition needs. But we're just going to cover the basics and go from there. So, without further ado, I always like to start my talks when it comes to swine nutrition with pointing out something that may or may not be obvious to people. You may or may not know that a pig is a monogastric. With the popularity of pastured pork production, we see a lot of pigs being raised on grass right now. And I think that does give some people the misconception that pigs are animals that in the wild, they live outside, people are raising them on pasture, that must mean they can eat and digest grass. Unfortunately though, because they are they're monogastric, which is a single chambered stomach, that reduces their capacity to appropriately digest forages, at least as compared to ruminants. Ruminants have a 4-chambered stomach. That 4-chambered stomach includes a very large vat known as the rumen, which is specifically designed for fermentation of forages or high cellulose products that allow them to break that down, and then they get the byproducts of that fermentation to supplement their diet and to actually feed the animal. When you feed a ruminant, you feed the rumen, and then the rumen will feed the rest of the animal, particularly in terms of protein and some other macronutrients. For a pig, we don't have that fermentation vat. It's not there. A pig's stomach is actually very, very similar to human digestive system. We have a single chambered stomach, and then we go into our small intestine, large intestine, and then pigs do have a little bit larger colon than humans do. So they have some capacity for fermentation in the hindgut, but not an exceptional amount. So in general, their fermentation is limited. Now, if you keep in mind that their digestive system is so similar to ours, we know that we eat vegetables for very specific reasons. We need vegetables for vitamins and minerals, and we need vegetables almost predominantly for fiber, because humans don't break down that fiber very well, and we need fiber in our diets for other reasons. So we don't get a ton of nutrition out of strict vegetables, and I'm talking lettuces, which would be much more similar to grass, or common forage items that pigs are being exposed to, so that they have that limited ability to actually get anything out of grasses. And because those pigs are monogastric, again, limited ability to get anything out of grass, so they don't get a lot of energy or protein out of it. So even forages that are high in energy or protein, they're going to have a difficult time getting that energy or protein out of it because they can't break down the fiber that is within those forage compounds. To move a little bit away from that monogastric, from grasses, I'm sorry. We also know that because a pig is a monogastric, what is eaten is directly utilized in the body, and it's not really transformed in any way. So it's really easy for a pig to need a different diet based on what growth demands are happening at the time. And I say this and I point it out because there's a lot of bagged feed companies, particularly the further you move up north, where there's really a lot of limited offerings. They might offer a grower diet and they might offer a sow diet, but that's really all that's available. And if you can find both a sow and a grower in one location, sometimes you're doing pretty good. So understanding that to feed a pig appropriately, it actually is advantageous to adjust their diet based on their stage of growth, as opposed to just giving them the same bag of feed all the time. And if you happen to be in an area where you only have access to one or two types of pig feed, understanding what those different requirements are at different stages can help you either extend that diet, so maybe add a little bit of fiber or add a little bit of energy and dilute protein, or you can supplement that diet. You can add external protein sources, you can add external energy sources to that diet to get a little bit more range out of it. But I always like to point out that while it would be nice to think that we can feed pigs all the same thing, if we're looking to support their growth needs are going to be different at different times. And so we need to recognize that a boar diet is not the same as a pregnant sow, is not the same as a barrow or a wean pig or a feeder pig. I do see a question that says, is there presentation slides or just the main title slide? I am moving through a presentation. Can you all see that or just this front slide? Maybe Colleen can pipe in here.
It is just the front slide. So if you have moved forward.
I have moved forward, I'm sorry. Let's see, let's try this again. Interesting. All right, is it moving for you now?
Yes.
Okay, good. Sorry about that. Apparently Zoom is gonna just keep being quirky here. So all you really missed is this. You got to see a picture of a stomach within a pig. And we will share these slides after the presentation, so we don't have to worry too much about that. You didn't miss a whole lot. All right, so what does a pig need to eat? So pigs can't just survive on grass alone. We need to make sure that we give them protein. Pigs need protein because they produce tissue. Ultimately, every pig that is produced on the planet is probably going to be eaten, with some limited exceptions. And so pigs produce meat, they produce fat, they produce baby pigs that are going to become meat and fat that will be eaten, and they produce milk to feed those baby pigs. All of those tissues and actually every process in the body works as a result of protein and amino acids in some form or fashion. But when we talk about protein, you need protein to build tissues in the body. And all of those proteins are made up of amino acids. Normally in my grow finish nutrition talks, I talk a little bit more about amino acids. We know quite a lot about amino acid requirements for grow finish pigs. We know a little bit less so for sows and boars, but the more advanced or the more energy and efficiency focused you are in your program, the more you're going to worry about specific amino acid requirements for pigs in their diet. All pigs need energy. It takes a lot of energy to build tissue and run the body. Again, same as people. People need protein to build tissue. People need energy to get up and run run around and run our errands and give webinars all day. Vitamins and minerals. Vitamins and minerals are the nuts and bolts of the system. I had a colleague tell me a really interesting story once about having a sheared lug nut on his vehicle that caused the wheel to kind of wobble and want to fall off while he was driving. And he was in a situation where he couldn't stop and address this sheared lug nut and had to continue to try and drive the car as the wheel kept trying to come off of his vehicle. And so he described the drive as, you know, he'd put the wheel back on, drive maybe a mile or a half mile, and then he'd have to stop and readjust the wheel and keep driving this entire length that he had to travel with the vehicle. For pigs, they can have vitamin and mineral deficiencies, and in the body, it turns into essentially driving a car with a broken lug nut, where it'll run, it'll operate, it'll get you to where you're looking to go. It's just not going to operate very well. It might grow, for a pig, they might grow slower. They might not come back into season for breeding. They might not have as many pigs, etc. The nuts and bolts of that system are often very easy to overlook for pigs. And then finally, fiber. Mentioned fiber right up front because I wanted to get any misconceptions addressed right away. Again, in Grow Finish Talks, fiber has very limited use due to the high growth demands of pigs. Fortunately, though, for sows and boars, they can utilize fiber quite a bit better in their diets, and there's a much more significant role for fiber in their diets as compared to Grow Finish pigs. So let's talk about some nutrients. First and foremost, we always want to talk about water. Water is the most important nutrient. The animal will only live a very short period of time without any water at all. Couple days usually if you have absolutely no water at all. Animals are very often placed in a slightly dehydrated state, usually because of access issues where they're unable to get to water or they're unable to get to clean water that's attractive for them to consume. And water is often overlooked for a lot of these reasons. It's something that they need. It's not anything that we can really do a lot to change. And it takes a lot of work to get it to livestock in some instances. But it is really important. The number one way to slow down feed consumption, which turns into slow down growth or slow down performance or health in some way, is to limit water or to not have enough water for your animals to consume. For pigs, I believe very strongly that they should have constant access to water 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They should never have to go looking for water. It should be available to them. Now, I understand I say that, and then I know that there are some that raise their pigs out. They run them through the woods, or you have constantly moving pastures, and so getting water is difficult to those animals. But I like to encourage everyone to make that a priority on your farm, that if there is some way where you can get them access where they can have water free choice as often as possible, that is a very good goal for your operation. I do also encourage a lot of people to use nipples or controlled dispensers, something where the pig has to activate it. We don't necessarily want it electronically activated, but a manual activation so that that water is always there. We minimize waste. And then we also can utilize it as a training tool. So pigs are highly trainable. You can train them to dung in certain locations, depending on where you put the water is usually what trains them to dung in certain places. And if you're out in a pasture or a lot, you can train them to put their wallows in certain places based on where you put the water, again, for ground conservation. I don't advocate pans, buckets, or pails because those get tipped over very easily. Pigs are somewhat short-sighted animals, as most animals are in general. They see what their immediate needs are. They're not planning for the future. So when they take a drink of water and it's 90 degrees outside, they drink their fill. Once they're no longer thirsty, the rest of that bucket of water is just a play toy at this point or something they can use to cool themselves down. We don't necessarily want them wasting that water just for your sanity and trying to take care of your animals and hauling water all the time. And then, of course, water quality related issues. You can have significant health issues with poor water quality. I can't identify anything off the top of my head other than some projects that I have worked in where we saw noticeable differences in offspring in nursery pig mortality and health in relation to water quality issues. We had higher death rate and more sick pigs in a farm that had really severe water quality issues. Once they addressed the water quality issue, it remedied a lot of the issues that they were facing overall. Similar to sow farms and any other farm that has a pig, you want to make sure that you're giving them as good quality water as you can get into their system. All right, so beyond water, of course, there's more than just water. We need to give our animals protein. Mentioned the need for protein earlier. This is the building blocks of everything in a biological system. You need to be able to build tissue, you gotta have protein. In growing pigs, this is where the lysine conversation has been driven predominantly. We know in growing pigs that they are putting on muscle. Muscle requires a specific amino acid profile in order to build that muscle, and not all amino acids are produced by the body of the pig. So the pig can't produce all of those amino acids based on what's coming in from different protein. It has to get certain amino acids specifically and then contribute them to muscle growth. So in growing pigs, we know that lysine is the first growth rate limiting amino acid. If you don't have enough lysine, you're going to slow down muscle deposition in those finished pigs. This makes lysine one of those key amino acids where the entire diet and protein profile can be designed around that lysine content of the diet and the lysine ratio. This is really commonly referred to as an ideal protein. So the ideal protein content of a diet is designed around how much lysine is in that diet and in what ratio it is to other amino acids. For reproductive stock, lysine is still important, however, it is minimally important. Unfortunately, we don't know what the first rate limiting amino acid is in reproductive stock. There's about 20 amino acids that we consider essential for pigs and need to be supplied in the diet. And because the focus has been on lysine for so long, we don't necessarily know if maybe there's a different ideal protein profile for reproductive stock. All we know is that we do know they need a certain level of lysine, and outside of some specific stages and specific diets, it's a fairly minimal requirement. We just need to make sure that they get enough for maintenance. And that's because your reproductive stock is largely mature. They're not putting on any additional muscle for themselves. Instead, that lysine is utilized in late gestation when the offspring is putting on muscle, so that those gestating fetal pigs, for milk production for the sow, and then that boar does need a base level of lysine in order to keep up their activity. Excuse me. So how do we get protein to pigs? Protein is a base macronutrient for your diet. You can create amino acid balance given different protein sources. And in pigs, we shoot for amino acid balances that are driven largely by soybean meal. We focus a lot on soybean meal as the protein source for pig diets because it complements corn very well. The amino acids that corn is low in, soybean meal is high in, and vice versa. Amino acids that corn is high in, soybean meal is low in. So it creates a very nice balance of essential amino acids when you utilize soybean meal with corn. One of those reasons as to why that particular mixture and ratio is so popular among pig diets. Though you don't have to use soybean meal, you can use other cereal grains. There are people that use wheat and milo, sorghum to varying degrees. Of course, those all have a different protein profile, and so they need to be balanced with other ingredients to create that ideal dietary protein profile within that diet. But you'll see it's pretty common for people to include things like wheat midds into a diet to help supplement that protein source for animals. Usually those are included with other ingredients to help the pigs access the protein from those feedstuffs. And then out here in the East Coast, it's very, very popular to utilize byproducts for pig feed. So byproducts of either the food and beverage industry or byproducts of processing itself. It's very, very popular to utilize whey and casein or milk byproducts out in this part of the world. It's really popular to utilize bakery waste. Confectionery waste, junk food production waste is essentially all grouped into that category. And so that's any kind of byproduct from production of human foods, predominantly junk food. In Pennsylvania being one of the junk food capitals of the world, we have quite a lot of bakery waste that goes into pig diets and cattle diets down here. So there's a lot of byproducts from the Hershey plants. There's a lot of byproducts from the potato chip plants. Those things very often go into pig diets and are a fairly reliable source of protein and economical source of protein, as well as energy. There's also a lot of poultry meals, so byproducts of poultry processing, beaks, feet, feather meal, things that can be ground up, and then again, fish meal, so processing of fish products. We're close to the coast, so there's fish bone and scale meal that can be utilized in pig diets. And then finally, there's synthetic amino acids. When we're creating an amino acid balance, your available ingredients might be missing one or two amino acids, and so you can add in a synthetic amino acid to make up for that lack. So I see a question here. So for those that don't have access to other sources of protein, is soybean meal and fish meal a good source of protein? So soybean meal itself is a very good source of protein, and it is highly digestible provided it's ground into a meal. Fish meal is also an excellent source of protein provided it's ground into a meal. Says, oh, you have here that you're from East Africa. So yeah, in the States, fish meal is not very common. Again, because of that non-complementarity to corn, and corn is so popular here, but also because it's expensive. Fish meal is very expensive here in the States. I don't know what the cost is in Tanzania, but if it's of a cheaper compound there, or maybe it's one of the only proteins you can get, it's a highly digestible and actually really desirable protein source for pigs because they can utilize fish meal to such a great extent. So that's a good question. Another question I have, do you get the same amount of nutrition after fermenting a prepared meal? Fermentation's a little bit trickier. Let me get through energy and fiber and I'll come back to that one. So energy and fiber in a pig diet are again needed so that that animal has that energy to continue to operate. And I group fiber in here because very often we're feeding, at least in the States, very often we are feeding pig diets that have a grain or a vegetable component to it. So it's going to have that high fiber source and often associated with energy. But we really need those two items to complement themselves in a reproductive animal diet. We need high energy in certain instances. High energy is really important for lactation. I have finishing pigs on here as well, but in the reproductive herd, lactation is where high energy is needed the most. You do need fiber in a reproductive animal's diet. You cannot go without fiber. There's a lot of research that shows that if you try and take fiber out of a lactation diet, to favor high energy or high protein, you're going to reduce your sow's ability to produce milk, to feed her offspring, to even eat enough food to meet her other nutrient requirements. So we know that both energy and fiber are really, really important in that situation. Energy and fiber, as I said before, because we have monogastric animals, can't be obtained within the animal during fermentation because they cannot ferment it themselves. They also have a limited stomach size, so we need to balance that energy and fiber because they will eat either to gut fill or caloric need, whichever one they meet first. So if they reach gut fill first, they'll stop eating, even if they haven't eaten enough calories, which is pretty critical, again, during lactation. That's really critical that we want to make sure that they get enough calories. So balancing that energy and fiber is really important. Now, in a situation where you might want to ferment a prepared meal so that you can make either more energy available from a highly fibrous source, that gets kind of tricky with pigs. With pigs, they can eat a fermented food. There's nothing wrong with having them eat a fermented food. It's the fermentation process itself can be really tricky in agricultural settings because it's easy to develop things like mycotoxins and molds and fungi in those feedstuffs. And pigs are pretty sensitive to poor tasting food, tasting feeds, as well as the mycotoxins or other toxins that can be released by those molds and fungi. So one, pigs are particularly picky. So if you want to feed a fermented meal, it would be advantageous to have one that is a total mixed meal that is then fermented very specifically and tested for quality. If you're going to ferment a high fibrous product, make sure that you are monitoring mycotoxins or any kind of toxin that might be induced during that fermentation process. Because pigs will either reject that food completely. If they don't like what it is, they just won't eat it. Or if it's the only option they have, so you've mixed everything together and they can't sort through it and pick out what they like or what tastes good, they will just eat less of it. They'll only eat as much as needed, and they'll probably lose quite a bit of weight and not be able to perform like you'd expect them to. So fermentation, while a pig can't do that fermentation themselves, they're also really sensitive to poorly fermented foodstuffs, though they can eat it. So it's more of a balance of if you are going to ferment something, don't allow them to sort it out. So you need to teach them that eating something that tastes fermented is okay as long as it's of high quality. It's kind of a tricky behavioral quirk there where pigs are really sensitive to taste. If they don't like it and they have the option to eat something else, they will. But it's also a good habit of theirs that if something doesn't taste right, it probably saves them from toxin exposure. So that's energy and fiber lumped into one. We'll talk a little bit more about those ingredients and to address that fermentation question. You can utilize some fermentation outside of the pig. They can't ferment themselves is kind of the big story there. So if we're going to talk about energy and fiber, where do we get energy for pig feed stuffs? Energy comes from carbohydrates, right? Breakdown of sugar and starches is how humans get energy from feedstuffs, or from our feedstuffs. I guess if you eat a Twinkie, that's pretty much all sugar, versus if you eat a cucumber, that's almost all fiber. So we have some kind of level of what gives us energy. For pigs, it's the same sources as where you would get protein, only it's a different component of those sources or a different type of those sources. So I mentioned a lot of cereal grains before. Again, the same thing for carbohydrates and energy. You want to utilize cereal grains. Again, in the States, this is really popular. We're really efficient at growing grain over here. And so that's why we utilize a lot of grains. Corn is the predominant source of energy in a pig diet. Most corn soybean diets have about 70% corn and then about 30% or less of soybean meal in a standard pig diet. And so those high energy, very, very starchy grains or vegetables are the preferred choice for obtaining carbohydrates. Another good choice is barley. But I have on here to show is that in terms of carbohydrates and in protein, you need to make sure that you grind the products down. They need to be ground into a meal in order for the pigs to utilize them. They need to have a small particle size. Again, that's to get past that high cellulose outer layer. For corn and for barley, they both have a very high cellulose hull around that particular grain. So you have to crack and grind up that hull in order to maximize your animal's ability to get at all of those carbohydrates, that high starch, high sugar content within. For energy in pigs, you can also get it from utilizing fats. So you'll want to use either vegetable oil or choice white grease are the preferred fats in pig diets. You can also use tallow, which is beef fat or other animal fats, to put up that energy. Utilizing fats can be a little bit tricky. We don't want to feed a pig too much fat. Fat's a little harder to break down. It doesn't necessarily have that same those same triggers in the body for where to direct nutrients during different stages of production and demand. But utilizing some fats can help build up the energy for those diets. And then finally, byproducts. Again, bakery waste. Bakery waste is both very high in protein and in energy, depending on what type of bakery waste it is. And I make the note on here to say that depending on where you're getting that bakery waste and how it's been processed, in the states, it might require some permitting. This is a little bit more relevant to smaller farms that might be working with a grocer who has some waste that they're getting rid of. Making sure that you inquire in your state if there's any kind of permitting for that to feed it to livestock is very advantageous. And then fiber. Fiber is needed for reproductive animal diets. Those animals are largely in a state of maintenance, and so we want to utilize fiber to help them feel full and to keep their systems moving, per se. So here, grass is good, though it is really difficult to control how much your pig is chewing on when you put them out in a grassy lot. Having observed many pigs out on pasture, if they're fed well and all of their caloric needs are being met and they don't feel hungry, they're generally going to browse a little bit on the grass, but for the most part, rip it up if they're bored. If you are trying to utilize it as a fiber source, making sure that that grass is something your pigs actually go after and actually will chew on is really advantageous, because controlling how much they're consuming in a grassy lot situation can be quite difficult. If you're going to provide fiber for them to chew on, it's okay to provide it free choice. So hay nets or buckets with loose straw or hay in there is really okay for pigs, no problem there. Again, the idea is the fiber is to supplement, and they'll eat it as needed. If you're going to mix it into the diet, it's advantageous to stay below 10% of the diet. Usually the recommendation is around 3 to 6%, though that varies quite a bit, again, with stage of production and what your goals are with your animal, though it's almost always recommended to stay 10%, below 10% of the diet in terms of weight. You don't want to give them a ton of additional fiber because you do need your pigs to eat that appropriately designed nutritional profile. You can offer it in straw, you can offer it in low quality hay. I caveat that low quality hay with high lignin hay. So something that has a really high fiber content is okay. You don't necessarily want to give them anything that's too moldy or too dusty. If you wouldn't give it to your horse because of allergies, I would not recommend giving it to a pig. So then there's alfalfa, use with caution. There is some old information about alfalfa. Alfalfa does have estrogenic content, so alfalfa is high in estrogen, relatively speaking, compared to a lot of other feedstuffs. So there is some caution in some of the old literature about feeding alfalfa to pigs and that you can mess up their reproductive cycle if you feed too much alfalfa. I don't know of anyone that's had any of those issues recently. I actually don't know too many people that utilize a ton of alfalfa in their system with their pigs, but just a word of caution in feeding alfalfa. And always with fiber, with any forage source, be cautious of mycotoxins, molds, and fungi. If you have any question on if that feed stuff has been sitting around too long and it might have grown some mold, throw it out. Your pigs are either going to tell you that they don't want it and they won't eat it, or it's going to make them sick. So it would err on the side of caution when it comes to utilizing your forages or your fiber sources for your pigs. So with the macronutrients for protein, fiber, and energy, we can get those from a variety of different compounds. It really depends on what is available to you at a reasonable cost and how you can put that all together. However, for vitamins and minerals, I do recommend that you pursue a pre-purchased vitamin and mineral that you can mix into the diet that is both stage of growth or age and environment specific. You are probably going to have different vitamin and mineral deficiencies in different parts of the world, particularly if your pigs are outside and they have access to soil. There's always the mantra that pigs need to have iron injections. Baby pigs don't produce enough iron when they're born. However, pigs that are out on soil get exposed to so much more iron than pigs that are raised in confinement. And so making sure that you pick a vitamin and mineral that is both stage of production appropriate and environment appropriate is very advantageous in the long run. And make sure that you get a vitamin and mineral that can be mixed into the diet, not something that is standalone. Those standalone vitamin and minerals run the same risk as poor quality forages that are offered free choice. Those pigs will either eat all of it or they won't eat any of it. And then you'll end up with an animal that's either wasting your mineral and possibly facing toxicity, or they are just not getting what they need to support their needs. Pigs are picky, they will sort if given the chance, so always provide them a mixed diet if there's a high chance they're going to sort something out and not eat it. So when we're feeding pigs, again, I give some of these talks for grow finished pigs, but I want to make sure that we are all talking about the same animal. This is a reproductive series. You all, many of you have tuned in to the other series, so I hope we're all on the same page that we're talking about mature sows and boars. We're talking about a gestating sow. We're talking about a pubertal gilt or a gilt that's being bred. We are not talking about grow finished pigs. That distinction is really key because the goal is very different. I am going to go into some of the specific nutrient recommendations at this point, and so this is probably going to run us over a little bit. We know it was stated to the hour, but this is probably going to run us over just a little bit to give you all a heads up. This will be recorded. This is being recorded, so you can always come back to it. But wanted to make sure that we are all on the same page, that these are the animals we're talking about. We're talking about those that are making babies, basically, and not making bacon. So what does the breeding herd need? Here is a very large and somewhat intimidating table for you all to look at. There is, in the States, there is a guide referred to as the nutrient requirements or recommendations for swine. They have them for a variety of species. These tables come out of there and they're based on fast growing animals. This is the most up-to-date information we have when it comes to nutrition for livestock. So I want to break this table down a little bit and kind of highlight what information is in here and how you can utilize it when you're going to look for different feedstuffs for your feed programs, or how to actually feed your animals, your breeding stock in the barnyard. So first we have our big intimidating table. There's a lot of information on here. It's not as scary as it looks. Let's hide some stuff. So First, we will take out some of these additional numbers. Body weight is always a good thing to know on your breeding stock, but most people have a better idea of how productive that animal is or what age it is rather than knowing a specific body weight. Getting a difference between 315 pounds or 370 pounds, some people struggle with, and it looks very different from across different breeds. So we're going to focus on parity. You'll notice that they break out parity in either first parity, second, third, or over 4, meaning they've had either 3 litters or they've had more than 4 litters. Also, we have up here anticipated weight gain and anticipated litter size. I'm going to break this down to anticipated weight gain by pig. It doesn't actually break down quite that nicely. So if we were to run a trial and I ran it this way, we wouldn't get similar results. But on average, it's going to look a little bit like this. And these numbers show you that your low parity sows are going to gain more weight per pig. So they're going to put on more body weight per pig during gestation than your older sows are, so your sows that have had multiple litters. This number, that amount of weight gain per pig, tells us that these younger parities are still growing themselves. So they are still putting on a certain amount of tissue, their bodies are still getting longer, they're still putting on muscle. So those sows are still growing in those early stages of reproduction. This is highly advantageous. If you want to increase litter size, it is very good to breed pigs while they are still growing because you can have an influence on that uterine capacity. But they are going to need more feed. They're going to eat a little bit more and need more feed per pig. So you might have a smaller litter size, even though they're still putting on weight. And that's something that's really important to look at, particularly for your extremely young and your extremely old sows. Your extremely old sows are going to be really pretty efficient with their diet. They should not need a lot of extra food or energy, not even a lot of extra protein. Your younger ones are going to need a more dense diet in order to keep up because their body is still growing in addition to producing those young pigs. All right, so weight per pig. Again, these are not hard numbers. This is an estimation to show you that they are putting on more body tissue per pig that they are gestating as compared to their older counterparts. In this particular table, from here on out, we are going to focus on before day 90 of gestation. Day 90 of gestation, or the before day 90 of gestation, so from the day of breeding to around day 90, that's the first 3/4 of gestation. So most of you are probably thinking, yeah, that's the majority of gestation. Surprisingly, what has happened in all of those 90 days is a lot of cells have replicated, some tissue has mineralized, there's been a lot of proliferation of cells within those developing piglets, but there hasn't been a lot of size growth. So there actually hasn't been a ton of structure put down on those pigs up until day 90. Where they've developed, they actually look like a little pig at that point, but they're not very big. They're very, very small. They haven't filled out any of their muscle. They haven't, the sow herself hasn't started putting tissue towards building her mammary gland until that point. And so that day 90 is a really key transition phase during gestation in the physiology of that sow. And so prior to day 90, she actually really doesn't need a ton of feed. And we want to keep her weight fairly well controlled. She needs to put some weight on. Again, those younger sows need to put on quite a bit of weight throughout gestation overall, but they don't need to gain a ton of weight. It needs to be very carefully managed and controlled because the offspring aren't utilizing that a lot of the nutrients yet, and that sow is not needing to put on excess weight. If you feed too much prior to day 90 of gestation, you are very likely going to end up with a very fat, overfed sow. So I want to make a very, very important note and distinction here that day 90 of gestation is really important in managing weight of your sow. Don't feed her too much up front. I can also point out here that regardless of age of your sow and how much weight she'll need, we're really not changing our diet. Our diet profile overall can stay the same in terms of energy. So in terms of the amount of energy that she needs, that can stay the same. She doesn't need any additional energy during this time. So our next thing that we're going to simplify here is that we're looking at how much feed intake she's going to have per day. I have this in pounds, so for those of you that are operating in kilos, just divide by 2.2. We have pounds per day of feed. I know that it is really convenient to take big scoops and just scoop a whole bunch of feed into a pig pen and let the pigs sort it out. What I'd like to show here is that you'll notice all of these numbers prior to day 90 of gestation are under 5 pounds a day. Under 5 pounds a day. This is for pretty high growth rate animals. So these sows put on a lot of weight when they are growing. They are well muscled animals, not extremely muscled, but well muscled animals. And so when we get to that switch from growing and developing to post-puberty, it's pretty easy for producers to not realize that their animals don't need a ton of feed anymore. They were probably fed free choice when they were developing. You might have been feeding them in a group and they could go to the feeder when needed. But once they reach puberty and you've entered them into the breeding herd, they need to have a controlled feed intake. So for our developing animal, or for our mature animals, we really want to feed them less than 5 pounds per day, particularly in this early stage of gestation. We need to manage weight. We don't want them to get fat. So let's make sure that we keep their net energy content consistent. We make sure that we give them the right profile, but we're not giving them too much feed in volume. So keeping it less than 5 pounds of feed per day is highly advantageous. And then finally, we have our crude protein per diet. That's the other thing you'll notice here is where we have that weight gain that is increased early on in sow's young life, as opposed to when she's had a few litters. That is also reflective in how much crude protein she needs. So she doesn't need additional energy during gestation. It's not about energy, it's about crude protein. We want to make sure that we have that additional crude protein in the diet early on, as opposed to after she's had a few litters, she's much more efficient and doesn't need so much crude protein. So the summary for feeding in early gestation is make sure that you feed by parity, tailor those diets, particularly for those that are less than P3 and those that are greater than P4. Be aware that your young gilts and sows are still growing. Even though they've been bred, they are going to grow in size. So make sure that you feed that growth. Feed less than 5 pounds per day when we're talking prior to day 90 of gestation. Don't give free choice. Don't just pour a ton of feed in a feeder and let them go after it, but also make sure that she gets her allotted amount. If you have 3 sows in a pen and you throw 15 pounds in there, and then just hope for the best, there's probably going to be a sow that's not going to get her share, and then she's going to be underfed. So it's really advantageous to try and get those sows individually fed as much as possible. And then finally on crude protein. This is particularly important if you struggle to get different types of pig diets. So you might only have a grow finish diet or a sow diet. And a lot of those tend to be high in crude protein. You can spread that out a little bit. You can use a little bit of fiber or dilute it with maybe a little extra energy if your energy is not up high enough, to dilute that diet out a little bit and reduce that crude protein. While those animals are still growing, they don't need a ton of crude protein. They've put on most of the lean they're going to put on. So give them a little more, but they don't need a ton. And protein is expensive, so it's not worth wasting that additional protein. Question, how do you recommend individually feeding sows in a shared pen? You can train sows pretty well to locations. So group pens in commodity production, they tend to have like shoulder barriers, and those sows will go up to a shared trough, but they'll go in between the shoulder barriers at their designated spot when feed is dropped. Much like a dairy cow likes to come up, I don't know if any of you have worked with dairy cows. Dairy cows like to come up to the parlor to be milked at a specific time. They kind of just know that I'm first in line, so I'm going to get up there first. Same thing with a pig. They'll develop a routine and go to a certain spot when you go in there. So that's a good way to take advantage of their highly trainable nature and train them to go to different corners of the pen to drop their feed. I'm not saying they won't steal another sow's feed, but if you get them a little bit away from each other, that at least gives each one of them a shot to consume their allotment before they go steal from someone else or have it stolen from them. So moving on with gestation. I made a big deal about separating out gestation at day 90. So once we cross that day 90 threshold, the piglets and the mammary gland are now both developing at a rate that is exponential. So the piglets are putting on an exceptional amount of weight in that last quarter of gestation. And the mammary gland is also now developing. So bagging up, you might notice that that mammary gland is actually looking like it has something in it now in your gestating sows. And that's developing tissue. And that is where we have a little bit more demand on that gestating sow. They need to have a little bit more nutrition or a little bit different nutrient profile. Here we see in the recommendations though, we don't add a ton of extra feed. So we get closer to 6 pounds. We move a little bit away from that 5, but it's between 5.5 to 6 pounds. So you get, you'll get to offer your sow a little bit additional feed. We're not looking for any additional energy. We're just looking for some additional crude protein. So here's where, again, you're going to add a little bit more feed for your sow and maybe increase the amount of protein offering. So if you only have one diet and it's we'll just assume it's a 15% crude protein, early on in gestation, you can dilute that out a bit, save yourself some of that bagged feed with either, again, some additional energy or maybe some fiber. The closer you get to day 90 or after you cross that day 90 threshold, it's okay to back off on that dilution and give her a little bit more crude protein. Late gestation feeding summary is, again, very similar to the front end of gestation. However, again, we don't want to allow free choice. We do want to give them a little bit more feed, but we don't want it to be too much. And also increasing crude protein in late gestation can be really advantageous. There's a lot of good benefits for increasing crude protein during that late gestation stage, particularly in piglet weight and in piglet survivability after birth. So highly recommend increasing that crude protein if you are able to, or giving them a little bit more once they cross that day 90 threshold. But again, we want to be careful. We don't want to just throw a whole bunch of additional feed in there. We have to manage that sow's weight. So for our reproductive herd, for the sows, we're going to exit gestation at some point and we're going to enter lactation. At some point is usually at farrowing. That is the best time to transition them from that gestation diet to a lactation diet. The lactation diets tend to be higher in crude protein in general. So it's actually really common for producers to either mix or make a slower transition from those gestation diets to those lactation diets the closer they get to farrowing. So within a couple weeks ahead of farrowing, they might start to transition that sow from a gestation diet to a lactation diet. And that works in really well with our need to increase crude protein or feed amount during that late stage of gestation. Couple things to highlight on this one. Again, there's a lot of numbers here, but there's some similarities between these two groups, and we're worried a little bit less about age in lactation. We're worried much more about how long is that sow lactating, how much feed do we expect her to eat, and again, that crude protein level. The mantra for lactation days, lactation in general, is that your animal should struggle to get enough nutrition during lactation. She should be milking hard enough that she is going to have a really, really hard time eating enough food to maintain her weight. And this is particularly true for pigs that have extended lactation days. So if you're keeping piglets on that sow for 30 days or longer, I've heard in some cases people keep them on much longer, you're going to need to make sure that she's getting enough groceries every day. She needs to get high quality groceries, so she needs to get something with, again, a little bit more crude protein in her diet. Milk production is very protein and energy heavy, so she's going to be eating a lot of feed to make up for that energy requirement, but she's also going to need a little bit extra crude protein during lactation in order to get that job accomplished. And you might be surprised to learn that while we do not want to offer ad libitum in gestation, it's pretty advantageous to eventually offer ad libitum in farrowing. Your sow should struggle to get enough nutrients in her body. It should be hard for her to eat enough. She should be producing that much milk, but we don't want her to be skin and bone. She isn't a dairy cow. So she is going to have a really high feed requirement, and offering as much feed as she can handle is usually the best strategy. These numbers here represent what's average feed consumption, or what they predict would be feed consumption of those animals during lactation. They expect that the older sows to eat a little bit more. They're usually making more pigs, they're making more milk than your first parity gilts. But overall, those sows are going to be eating a lot of feed every day. So making sure that they get both a high quality feed and are offered a lot of feed is advantageous during lactation. Though with that chart, I should highlight just a couple quirks on here. And this is where I said early on that there's not as much information available on feeding the reproductive herd as there is for feeding the grow finish pigs. And so in our chart, we saw that crude protein was being recommended around 12 to 13%. But they were looking at a litter size of about 11 pigs. With modern genetics, it's really common for producers to increase that crude protein allotment for their sows as litter sizes have increased. So it's really common anymore to see lactation feeds that offer a 17 to 21% crude protein amount. The research is still out on that as to whether or not that is completely necessary. It's always good to offer additional nutrition during lactation because, again, she's going to struggle to get enough of what she needs. But we want to make sure that we keep milk flowing. We don't want to be so obsessed with crude protein that she isn't getting enough fiber or not getting enough energy, because both of those will limit her ability to produce enough food for her offspring, which is what her goal is in lactation. And we also want to minimize extreme weight swings. So we don't want to put a fat sow into farrowing. She's going to struggle to give birth to those piglets, and she's going to struggle to milk for them. But we also don't want a sow that goes in really fat and then leaves really skinny, because she's going to struggle to be bred on the other side. So we want to minimize extreme weight swings. It's okay to have some weight swings. She's going to lose some weight in lactation, but we don't want extreme weight swings. Being really familiar with how to body condition score your sow is going to be really advantageous in your ability to adjust how much she needs to be fed. We have a question on here is, what is the minimum days piglets should be with the sow? That depends on your system. There is a physiological adaptation of that piglet, and they struggle really hard to adjust to solid foods prior to day 14 of life. But there is a range of people that keep pigs from as young as day 16, 17 in some instances, to as old as 6 weeks post-farrowing. Most sows will hit peak lactation between 21 and 25 days of post-farrowing. So after you pass 25 days, your sow is on a down curve in her ability to produce enough milk. Though piglets that are weaned a little bit earlier, they're getting optimal milk. It's just how ready are they to transition to solid feed. And depending on how you cater that solid feed to the piglets, they do actually transition pretty well. So it depends on your system. Piglets struggle quite a bit if you wean them before 14 days. I would not recommend younger than 17 days for most systems, because that gives a little bit of buffer to get them, again, adjusted to solid food, and their intestine is now developed for that. But some people do keep pigs on exceptionally long periods of time. Then finally, nutrient requirements for the boar. This one is, I don't want to say it's easy because it's not. There's still a lot of details that could be worked out about feeding boars, but the good thing about the boar is he essentially reaches a state of maintenance once he becomes a pubertal, sexually active boar. His goal is to produce semen and to either actively breed your sows or just to produce semen for insemination. So his job is pretty cut and dry. It doesn't change a whole lot throughout the year like a sow's does. So the mantra with a boar is maintenance. We don't want them to have ad libitum feed. Again, they can engorge themselves and they will just waste feed if you give them ad libitum feed or free choice. We do want them to have a little bit extra protein because of all the testosterone in their system and the fact that they do have to be active. It takes a lot of energy and a lot of muscle work for them to go find sows in heat and to produce semen for that matter. So we do want to make sure that they're getting a minimum crude protein and they're getting enough lysine, but they don't need excessive amounts by any means. Again, the story of the boar is maintain. You want a nice, lean, shapely boar like we have in this picture, one that's very active, one that's good on his feet, one that is motivated to pursue your sows in heat if you're using him for live cover. But we don't want him to get very big. We don't want an animal that's going to weigh 800 or 1,000 pounds, which can happen sometimes. So it's about maintenance when we're talking about the boar. So here's my last slide. Again, just a summary with kind of those key points of don't feed just a strict grow finish ration. Make sure that your diet is tailored to your animal as best as possible for both age and stage of production. When we're talking about mature animals, we're talking about maintenance plus work, not growth necessarily. For sows, feed by parity, stage of production, and expected performance. It's a Goldilocks situation for the sow. We're still trying to figure out where that perfect pot of porridge is, but don't overfeed and don't underfeed. It's really important to make sure she's getting her allotted amount. And then for the boars, feed to maintain, maintain, maintain. That is their mantra. That is their story. So I know I went over and I knew this was going to go over a little bit, but there's a lot of really good information here that I think is important and doesn't necessarily get out there very readily for pig producers. So hopefully you all find the recording of this particularly helpful. And I will wait for additional questions and answer those until about 1:30, and then we'll wrap this up. So what level of amino acids should be increased in total protein? So that is where I have my handicap. I said I'm a reproductive physiologist that likes nutrition. So this is where it gets complicated and I can't answer that question as adequately as a nutritionist could. Working with a swine nutritionist, if you want to start manipulating amino acid levels, is highly advantageous. let's go, that ideal protein concept is what drives what amino acid levels should be in your feed. It has far more to do with the ratio of amino acids to each other, and how those amino acids are being utilized at different stages of production than it is in just recommending, okay, we'll just increase your lysine or just increase your tryptophan. Those ratios, you may need more lysine in your diet, but if that lysine is not coupled with enough of, say we don't have enough methionine, then that lysine is only going to be able to be so utilized. The cool thing about amino acids is that they work together to build protein. And so you can have a whole bunch of amino acids, but if you don't have enough of that, of all of the different amino acids you need, you can't get that end tissue production that you're shooting for. So I can't tell you what level of amino acids should be increased instead of total protein because I don't have a clear answer there. It really depends on what stage of production, what are the other amino acids in the diet, and then go from there. Do pigs perform well on fodder compared to mixed grains? You asked a question earlier, Ernest. Okay, so in the US, we don't use a ton of fodder, so I don't have a great answer to that one, unfortunately. It's not common for us to specifically harvest fodder to feed to pigs. That's much more of a cattle feedstuffs in this part of the world than it is for pigs. And I assume you're referring to that root level part of the plant after harvest. So they feed a lot of corn fodder out here. Yep. And so for feeding pigs, mixed grains would be the superior or the preferred in the US. There's not a lot of information on feeding fodder in this part of the world, unfortunately. Good questions. Thank you all for your questions. And I appreciate you hanging in here for the extended time.
Yeah, and thank you so much, Dr. Hines. This was great. Doesn't look like we have any other questions coming along, so we'll close it at this. The recording will be available, and have a lovely day.